The tension in the room was thick enough to feel like it could be cut with a knife if one only dared to try. As the technically already disbanded but still acting Galactic Council was seated in a full assembly, ironically coming together out of turn in memory of the very man who had been the one to disband it. With Afyona's passing, a seat had opened in the governing body, and temporary as it may have been, it still demanded to be filled. Technically, it was of course an equal seat on the council just like any other, as all of the members sat on equal terms in the galactic government. However, even if that was the case, everyone was still acutely aware that it represented some enormous shoes that had to be filled here.
Nobody is denying that there are many promising candidates who would be able to more than satisfactorily fill a temporary seat on the council.
Acting Councilwoman Laura Polther explained, as she had been granted the word. The Xanathia's purple plumage lay sleek against her body, not raised to show even an ounce of nervousness as she spoke in front of the galaxy's leadership, making her stand on the hotly debated topic.
However, the late acting councilman Afyona was quite clear in telling the galaxy exactly who he wished to be his replacement in case of his premature passing. Every council person has the express right to choose their own deputy, as well as replacement within the council, should they so wish. Therefore, who should be first to be offered his seat is not even up for debate, and the fact that we are still discussing it is nothing short of insulting.
One of the claws on her wings tapped on the rostrum in front of her, which was also housing the microphone that enhanced her voice, to the point that it could be heard through the entire council hall. The room was enormous and ornate. No expenses were spared during the planning of it, back when the Galactic Council had finally outgrown its old home, back in the GCS, causing an entire station to be built that was meant for nothing but the express purpose of housing the governing body of the galactic community. A place where the Council could live and sit in session for undetermined times, without any outside interference. The station itself was modern and ornate, but otherwise built as basically any other, was as it served only the relatively humble purpose to give the council members a place to stay and live during longer assemblies, offering only mild luxuries to make the stay bearable, should it prove to drag on a bit. The main council hall itself, however, was something to behold. It was a round assembly of saucer-shaped structures, all standing next to each other with a surrounding radius of about 3 measures of free space. Each of these structures represented one of the seats of the Galactic Council, and they were highly automated and adaptable in their shape, allowing them to organically adjust to the council person that would take their place on them, no matter what size or shape they may be of. Through this adaptability of the seats, it was guaranteed that all of the council people would sit on eye level with each other, be they Pixameria or Zodaitos. None of them had to look up to the others. The same was, however, not true for the decorations that adorned the enormous amount of free space over the council's heads. It was orchestrated to invoke the idea of being able to look up towards a pantheon in the heavens, as enormous and marvellously carved and painted, larger-than-life statues of the members of the first founding council had been positioned within their own immobile mock-ups from the modern council seats beneath the ceiling, giving off the impression of those old, by now long-gone visionaries still sitting in assembly about the future of what they once created, even today. The idea was quite clearly brought across that the old leaders who had once brought the galaxy together were someone to look up to, literally in this case, an ideal to be aspired towards. With the current placement of her seat, Laura Polither was positioned in such a way that she could look straight up to the statue of Polren, the chosen representative that her very own people had once sent to advocate for their very own interest in the momentous occasion of the first large-scale alliance within the Milky Way galaxy. The statue had its head turned sideways a bit, allowing one of its eyes to look down directly onto the current council. The eye was carved and painted in such a way that a heavily pinned pupil was clearly visible, indicating that the late legend of a person was witnessing something thrilling occurring that filled them with enough emotion to have a physical effect, though whether that emotion was of a positive or negative nature was impossible to tell. Although it was admittedly a bit childish, Laura Polither quietly hoped to herself that her old predecessor wasn't gazing upon her in horror at the things she was saying here.
A rule that you're all too familiar with, of course.
The next person who had been granted the word responded to her statement with a snide remark that aimed to the origin of her own temporary seat on the council, and Laura Polither quickly pulled her gaze away from the statues and back down onto the real, current council, many of whom were judging her much harsher than the legends above ever could.
However, the core of this council is discussion and compromise. To claim it an insult to debate among ourselves, just because there was a reason against it, would render this entire governing body a farce. In the end, there are plenty of reasonable bases to deliberate, which very much call the idea of such an absolutionist stance into question.
The nostrils on acting councilman Kashalengas Zanshal's head flared a bit as he huffed out the rest of his breath once he finished his counterpoint with a simultaneously self-confident and deliberately harried expression on his slightly caved-in face. The shell of the old chorustilge was dull in the light, hinting towards a withered layer coating it instead of the usual hard and fresh scutes, which was the strongest indicator of his advancing age. Out of all the present acting council members, the Tetsundin was certainly the oldest now, closer in age to the late Afyana, and he has certainly known the Pethalsi the longest out of the present representatives. They had been friends for a very long time, and it was very clear from his demeanour that Zanshal saw himself as someone speaking with a good bit of authority when it came to the heritage of the late Elder of the Galaxy. The clearly overgrown claws in his white hands were locked in what was either a permanent nervous movement or some sort of involuntary tremble, as he threw heavily suppressed but still quite venomous gazes over at the Xanhathai.
We are all just acting council people now. There is no need to try and cheaply attack one of our own to try and distract from valid points.
A third voice entered the fray, causing both Laura Polither and Zanshald to turn their heads. The council member speaking now was seated quite far away from them, and so the old man had to clearly strain his eyes, especially to inspect the speaking party. Acting Councilman Vuhushwa was a tall-grown, even for the already enormous species, Lumagasil with a grey-white counter-shaded body. The large Chiroptera's long, flexible neck was bent in an arch as they swung their comparatively small head around to look at their two debating colleagues.
And it is not just a reason, speaking against denying the late Afyana one of his last publicly stated wishes. It is a quite fundamental rule of our council, as well as a simple matter of respect for him and his legacy, he continued, the nostrils on the bottom of his head narrowing into slits as he spoke, while his deep red eyes pierced into anyone that made contact with them. How else but through disrespect could we explain so clearly going against his will now that he is not here to defend it?
That will was never officially put in with the council.
Acting Councilwoman Komloka, a Cimmoreskis with humble, patternless beige fur, also chimed into the ongoing debate.
And just because it wasn't written down gives us the right to simply ignore it?
Laura Polither quickly retorted, quite glad that her request to speak again had been granted so quickly.
He proclaimed it openly to the galaxy. How much more of a clear statement could we possibly want? Nearly every single person under our leadership has likely heard him say it. Just how could you possibly hope to justify ignoring it by simply installing someone else than his declared successor into his seat?
An indignant sound escaped Zanshashild as he brought his shaky claws down onto the rostrum of his seat.
Afyana has never put in an official successor. It was always quite clear that his seat should be given to the one most deserving, decided not by him, but by those who rely on it.
The old reptiloid barked with a slightly raised voice. It was odd to hear such a usually noble statement be said with such vitriol and sounding so wrong due to it.
Yet, obviously, he changed his mind.
Vuhushwa countered that, briefly stretching one of his spindly arms to enfold the membrane spanning between the limb and his body.
Or are you claiming that someone as esteemed as this late legend of the galaxy would make such a meaningful announcement to the people based on nothing more than a fleeting mood? or, even worse, would make it without actually meaning it.
Although he was, at least to Luropolitha's knowledge, nowhere near as closely connected to Afyana as Xanashal was, the Limmelgassel seemed similarly outraged over the possible staining of the deceased's legacy, even if his ire was seemingly directed in the opposite direction. Although their microphones were not activated for it, an audible wave of mumbling of the many other, less involved council people, who chose to sit back and simply listen to the arguments provided, swept across the room at that, their voices echoing upwards underneath the high ceiling, and almost giving the impression that the statues above were arguing along with them.
Nevertheless, it certainly does make your case far less concrete that Aldwin was not officially put in as his procedural successor.
Someone new suddenly joined in, speaking in a deliberately calm tone, as their croaking voice was projected over the speakers.
I would say it certainly leaves enough room to argue if other aggravating circumstances shouldn't be considered in the decision as well.
The objection had come from acting councilwoman Kroshlock Fullatel, an Arhidutarian whose crumpled skin sported a colour that was disturbingly similar to raw flesh. The mini villi covering her entire surface swayed around like worms each time she moved, as she balanced herself awkwardly on all 8 of her near-identical limbs. Fullatel was the most recent acting council person added to the council, ever since she had taken over for her predecessor, Akorte Kun, who had winningly relinquished his seat within the council due to external reasons, and was currently held in custody on reprimand while it was investigated which of the claims about who ordered the outer orbital attack on Dunama would turn out to be true. That of the humans, who claimed that the then acting councilman was responsible, or that of the currently missing Captain Faramore Uton, who claimed himself to be the one who had given the order. It was not a secret to anyone that Fullatel firmly believed the humans to be behind the circumstances that had shaken Kun enough to relinquish his esteemed position and turn himself into the authorities, and she certainly wasn't very elated about what she perceived to be a fact. Thus, her opinions about letting the very human who was the most likely to be involved in such scheming into the council were likely not exactly the highest.
As honourable as that goal may be, it is, in my humble opinion, quite obvious that Afyana's main motivation in offering Aldwin the place as his successor was to try and quell the ongoing conflict in the galaxy by extending a hand to the revolting parties. I do not think it is reasonable to treat this succession like a deep wish of his heart. Instead, I would say it is more akin to a well-meant attempt that has ultimately failed. One of his well-known gestures of good faith, and therefore it should be considered as such. The amphibioid went on, her black eyes staring dead ahead as her wide mouth remained almost constantly open as she spoke. And because of that, we should very much scrutinize the idea of simply offering such a position of power to someone so hard to trust, especially since the very conflict he attempted to quell has ultimately cost Afyana his life.
There was a rumbling among the representatives after this, the statement very clearly ruffling some feathers, especially considering who it came from. After all, if the human accusations turned out to be true, former Councilman Kuhn would have been one of the foremost and most violent perpetrators of the described conflict.
A ridiculous twisting of events.
Acting Councilman Paralee, an aged Qoivery, almost immediately reared up in outrage, all of his flexible arms pressing onto the rostrum, as he leaned forwards with his eyes constricted into barely visible dots. While the humans have certainly given everyone more than just a few reasons to distrust them, especially with their latest grave violation of our territorial rights, it is nothing short of affronting to try and shift the blame for the councilman's death onto them. It was clear Paralee had been deeply hit by the unfolding events back on his homeworld. Understandably so. Not only had he, too, nurtured a long friendship with Afyana, but it had also been his territory in which he had found his end, during an attack that was, at least partially, directed at his people. By their own admittance, it was the Zodaitos who were responsible for the attack. the councilman continued, tempering his voice a bit, but still bringing a very grim determination across. You can criticize Aldwin for his deeds all you like. I know I certainly will. And I am not sure how comfortable I would be with him holding any sort of leading position myself, given his allegiances. However, to claim that we should disqualify him over his involvement in the conflict, after not one, but 2 breaks of the codes of war were committed by the non-revolting side of your oh-so-important conflict, is, plain and simple, ludicrous. And if even a modicum of his accusations are in accordance with reality, then he is by far the one with the most reasons to be distrustful.
I agree that claiming the person who is the target of 2 supposed assassination plots is the person posing the danger is hardly convincing for me as well. Vuhushwar concurred.
Once again there was mumbling. In some way, it was almost infuriating. The council was comprised of hundreds of members, so many that it had needed for the construction of an entire separate station to house them all together, and yet only a select few of them deemed it prudent to speak their mind on the topic, while the rest of them confided to lean back and mumble to themselves, or among each other. Here's a Deathworlder. The very idea that he needs to be the one treating others with caution is pah! Zanshachal spoke up once again, now saying the quiet part out loud, to the very clear annoyance of many of those among the council who were on his side of the debate. Someone who chooses to consume flesh without any natural obligation to do so as a vile, spiteful parody of his great order. Isn't the very fact that he deliberately consummates with the abominable and unnatural enough proof that he lacks the moral character to occupy this esteemed position? How could we ever stand before the people and explain to them that we allowed someone who allied himself with the declared enemy of everything that lives among their leadership without pushback? Although many of the things he had said didn't exactly help his point, many of the faces in the hall still lowered, as everyone had to think about the things that he said. A councilman like Aldwin, even just an acting one, would certainly have been unprecedented. In many ways. Carnivore, predator, Deathworlder, cyborg. And even if one had little problems with those characteristics alone, there was no debate that he had willingly chosen to work with a realized, which was simply unimaginable to even the most accepting among the council. Indeed, even Laura Polither herself still found that reality quite hard of a seat to crack. Even after everything that happened, she still supported Aldwin. She couldn't exactly explain to herself why, but she knew it was something connected to the first time she had met him, back during his supposed unlawful detention on Ostrinajar. Something about even just that short interaction, played up and acted as it had clearly been, had given her the belief that he was not a bad person, and certainly didn't wish harm upon others. However, his allegiance with the realized, just because he meant no harm, did not mean he could make no mistakes.
In the end, it was everything that lives, which has declared all realized as their enemy, not the other way around.
A deep, droning voice suddenly spoke up, and the statement caused an almost unanimous scandalized inhale to sweep through the room, as everyone's eyes shot towards the source of it. There, with her head held high on the long neck of her greenish-grey body, Acting Councilwoman Magistheria Avalogatha Tua, matriarch of the Zodaitos people, stood, her enormous tusks confidently bared towards the many more than surprised eyes staring at her with little understanding. Her split trunk was raised with its 2 ends touching to form an O shape, and it seemed like the 2 foremost of her 6 eyes were looking right through the thus created sights to focus right onto Acting Councilman Zanshachal.
It is true that there is a lot of precedence for realized to act hostile towards living sapients. In fact, unless you believe the statements retroactively provided by the Miat, it is the only precedent we have. However, even considering that, realized are not a collective. They do not have a society or any other form of alliance that would speak as one. In fact, they have not even evolved together as one species, instead occurring completely separately as unique individuals, with the only thing connecting them being the unknown mechanism of their creation. Considering that, we cannot entirely discount the idea of a realized that is not with the intention to kill senselessly. And even if a murdering realized is the norm, if among 10,000 citizens of the community we consider it reasonable to assume that there is one murderer, is it not just as reasonable to assume that among 10,000 realized, there is at least one with good intentions? It is not a guarantee by any means, of course, but impossible? I don't think so.
The room got very quiet after her statement. It was utterly obvious that no one knew how to react, not only to what had been said, but also to just who said it. The silence was so intense that it spread all the way up to the stone council above, with the statue's intense gaze suddenly seeming like even they had been taken aback by the sudden turn of events. A matriarch of the Zodiator so much as suggesting that a realized may not be an abomination to be ripped out by the root? This was certainly unexpected of a representative of one of the oldest core worlds. Could it be that she had truly taken her sister's passionate plea for open-mindedness to heart?
So far, we are the ones who declared it as the enemy,
Magistheria added onto her previous statement, as she realized that no one was quite ready to reply to it yet, allowing her trunk to sink down while her large cell-like ears flapped as if her head was trying to escape her body with them.
It, on the other hand, has, to my knowledge at least, not taken any actions that would suggest it sees us as its foes, or even worse, a plague to be eliminated, like so many of its brethren did. In fact, the only action we absolutely know for certain it has taken so far is to preserve lives, even if it was those of its ally. Though even then, claiming that saving an ally of its is somehow a hostile trait, there would be a ridiculous case of reaching for twigs.
It broke into our systems and terrorized Councilman Kuhn until he was forced to make a false confession.
Acting Councilwoman Fluletel quickly opposed that statement, as the first to break out of the shock of the sudden turn of events. Her outrage at the suggestion they realized could be innocent, abhorrently apparent in her outburst.
Allegedly,
Acting Councilman Farrelly grumbled with deep strumming tones, not making it a secret that he didn't think much of that explanation of how things had occurred.
An accusation with, quite unlike the attack on our own systems on Geroliton, no evidence exists yet.
Our systems were obviously tampered with,
Fluletel immediately protested.
Systems that any sufficiently resourceful hacker could have gained access into,
Farrelly retorted quickly.
That's hardly enough to make an ironclad case. If anything, it's almost insulting to the humans to suggest they would need the help of a realized to pull something like that off.
At that, Fluletel's eyes widened in appalled shock, before a loud and shrill warning siren sounded throughout the hall. A moment later, a small red light began to glow at the front of both council people's seats, indicating that they had been struck with an anonymously voted penalty that would prohibit them from being granted the word for a few minutes. Although Laura Polither had voted against the penalty, with her hand still hovering over the now disappeared button on the terminal of her seat, she couldn't say she was all too sad that it had gone through in the end. After they had been silenced, Laura Polither's eyes briefly shifted over to our own earlier verbal opponent. If he could have gone pale, she was sure that Zanshachard would have looked like a spirit by now. In fact, she was almost sure that his scales did, in fact, lose at least a shade of their green colour somehow, as he stood like someone who found himself in the headlights of an oncoming train. Clearly, while everyone had been shaken by what Magistheria had said, the same wasn't quite true for him. Instead, he had been rocked to his very core, and it seemed unlikely that he would recover in time to make a passionate plea for the opposition. In fact, for a moment, Laura Polither almost seriously feared for his health, hoping that his heart wasn't struggling to keep up its work after the shock to his system he had just gotten. Things were quiet again. Farrelly had crossed his many arms after he had been struck with the penalty, and even as the red light disappeared, he remained in that position, seemingly not intending to continue the earlier bickering. Fluletel still looked like the Coivory had personally defecated onto her rostrum, as her eyes remained on him. However, she too didn't say any more on the matter. Laura Polither had said what she had to say, and felt like simply repeating it now would simply cause a rollback of the discussion, and so she, too, kept her beak closed, briefly fluffing out her feathers, as the silence was quickly getting to her. And with Zanshachard clearly too dumbfounded to argue, it seemed that everyone who wanted to speak had made their case by now. Soon enough, the silence got pressing, and the Stone First Council looked down at his modern pendant with deeply judging eyes. However, the silence not only persisted because no one had anything new left to say. Instead, it also persisted because everyone knew. Everyone knew that usually it would have been him. It would have been Afyano to break the quiet and move the assembly on to his next stage. It felt almost presumptuous to even think of taking over that role now that he was gone, especially since they were discussing who would be his successor. While a new face could certainly take his physical place in the council, it was unlikely that whoever would fill his place would also be the one to take over his spiritual duties during these proceedings. Someone else would have to be the one to do that, and right now would be the time to take the first step to attempt to do just that. There were certainly promising candidates, but right now, the look on everybody's faces indicated that no one was truly willing to reach for that spot in the ranks just yet. In some cases, Laura Polither actually found that quite surprising. She would have expected at least one attempt at a power grab here. But then, suddenly, a deep sigh broke through the silence as one of the microphones was activated.
If no one has anything else that they wish to add to the discussion for consideration,
Councilman Vuhushwa hesitantly began to announce, and despite his quite enormous size even among the larger present species, he seemed incredibly small as he did so. His head hung deep from his enormous neck, and he wasn't really looking at anyone as he spoke. But still, he spoke nonetheless.
Then I move to put it to a vote. Are we going to
he began, though he interrupted himself with a slight flinch, obviously realizing something before he growled mildly to himself, with his nostrils flaring widely.
Are we going to offer candidate James Aldwin the open seat of acting councilman, in accordance with acting councilman Afyano's last verbal declaration? Or are we going to open the seat up for different candidates, in accordance to the councilman's earlier stated wishes?
Soon enough, the options appeared on the terminals of the different seats, causing all council people to look down at them. Aldwin, not Aldwin. Abstain. Those were the options. For a moment, the abstain button seemed ever so alluring, with an almost magnetic pull to it. However, Laura Polither had made this nest. Now she was going to damn well sit in it. And so, with another ruffle of her feathers, she decided to honor the old man's wish. I told him this was going to happen, James said, rubbing over his face as the topic of Afyano had naturally once again come up. Everyone had of course already talked about the entire thing plenty of times, but this was simply a topic that bared repeating. Although it was true that he had, in a way, called the bad outcome for the old councilman after announcing James as his successor, James felt far from good as he said it out loud. It would have been overstating it to claim that he was extremely distraught or emotionally distressed over the quite sudden passing of the old man. After all, he had known him for all about a week if he generously rounded up, so the personal impact of his death to James was rather low in comparison to many other things that have recently occurred. Still, it wasn't like it left him entirely cold either. Despite all of his flaws that James had never been shy to point out, towards the end, it really seemed like the old man had been on a path to at least relative betterment. He certainly hadn't been nearly as completely stuck in his ways as James had first suspected him of being. It was sad to think of the positive impact someone with his pull could have had he only lived to spread his new point of view. Gotta grant it to him. He stood by what he said. He added onto his previous statement, with a hint of undirected bitterness. Do you think they're really going to try and make you take his place? She'd asked, sitting next to him while strapped in with multiple belts just like he was, her body language indicating that she would have leaned against him had it not been for the secure safety measures. Her tail lazily swept across the seat, as the only currently entirely free part of her. Who knows, James replied. At this point, no successor for the acting councilman had been officially announced yet. Instead, the entire acting council had assembled, and it had been in session for quite a while at this point. They had all figured by now that those bigwigs were likely discussing just that question, and they could do little more but wait for the answer. I'm not even sure what I would do with it if they did. I certainly can't just take it. I don't think I can afford to confine myself to the council station at the moment, but just declining it also feels like a waste. Sheeda's ears twitched slightly, and she leaned her cheek into her palm as she looked over at him. Didn't stop you the first time? She very mildly teased him. James sighed in response, though a slight smile was on his lips. That was when it was just a gesture, he responded, and leaned back for a moment, pressing the back of his head against the backrest as he looked up to the dark ceiling. Now this is a real possibility. I gotta do something with it. Sheeda pondered for a moment, and then released a mild snort. You could take it, declare Avesalon as your successor, and then immediately resign, she suggested, with a semi-serious tone. That would shake things up for sure. James exhaled in a half cough for a moment, though he had to admit, I can't say that I haven't thought about that, but sadly it wouldn't work. A council person has to be an official member of the community. And as much as Avesalon's sapience is inarguable, I would sadly still have a very hard time claiming that she is a recognized citizen. I'm good at bullshitting, but I'm not that good. He paused for a moment, and then rolled his head a bit to glance over at her. You wouldn't happen to want to dip into politics? He said, and his dumb question wasn't even dignified with an answer, as Sheeda simply glared at him in response. Chuckling, he waved the topic off by shaking his head before looking straight up again. I'm sure we'll think of something, he then mumbled. We're not exactly lacking for people trying to get a seat on the council. Question is, who wants that kind of target painted on their back? Sheeda sighed, and stretched her legs for a moment. James could only nod. Though, speaking of targets... On a related note, are you sure you want to do this? He asked, sitting up properly again to look at her, as the topic got more serious. The Admiral said the Miat commander was pretty capable. You don't necessarily have to... James, they are restrained, under surveillance, and even when one of them gave me this beauty mark, I was in control of the situation. Sheeda interrupted him with a brief palm stroke across the scars of her cheek. I'll be fine. And just because someone already talked to them doesn't mean it would hurt for one of us to try as well. And since you can hardly look at them without getting all murdery, I think I'm the gal for the job. James exhaled a huff of breath that was still in his lungs from his unfinished sentence. I just want to try. Maybe I can find an angle that she didn't think of, Sheeda reassured James, placing her hand on his knee while smiling at him. I know you have a hard time relating to their thoughts, and I guess I can't blame you, but not too long ago I was a lot like them in many ways. And who knows if the same is true for that commander? It can't hurt, right? James exhaled slowly again. Well, it'll hurt me to have to restrain my idiot brain from overreacting, he finally replied with a half smile. But I'll deal. If you think there's a chance you'll learn more, go ahead. Sheeda seemed a bit angsty in her seat for a moment, but just that second, an indicator light suddenly informed them that the atmosphere outside of the craft had been reinstated. With that as a cue, Sheeda quickly unclipped the belt strapping her into the seat, and immediately leaned over to nuzzle against him. With the thought of what was going to happen next, the ugly overprotective side within him already reared its hideous head. However, he decidedly pushed it down as he briefly leaned his head onto Sheeda's. Who do you think you are? He internally told himself. A question that had popped into his mind quite often since his mother had so bluntly confronted him with it. And the more he thought about it, the more of a really good question it seemed to become.